Rio de Janeiro with its harbor like a fallen star, and the curve of its beaches with their names like songs. Flamengo, Botafogo, Copacabana.
Rio isn't what it was. These days, it's a city emblematic of a country in trouble. There are signs of corruption everywhere. From the football stadium rebuilt for the World Cup with dirty money, to the bay choked with pollution because corrupt officials never cleaned it. Then there's the violence. Last month, 28 were shot dead by the city's police in the bloodiest favela raid in Rio's history. And to top it off, the city's hospitals are struggling to cope with COVID-19. This is just one city in a country of more than 211 million people. But the problems it faces are felt nationwide.
I think it's going to be a really complicated and tense couple of years. It's something that the whole world should be paying attention to.
Despite all this, thousands of Brazilians were on the street last month to show their support for right-wing president Jair Bolsonaro, a former army captain famous for his racist, sexist and homophobic comments. His actions are now threatening not only Brazilian democracy, but one of the world's most important natural resources. So why are his followers still so faithful? Bolsonaro! And could the country withstand another 4 years of his leadership? Coronavirus has taken a terrible toll on Brazil. In April, the country suffered the highest rate of COVID deaths of any nation on earth. And many blame President Jair Bolsonaro for letting it get this bad. He famously dismissed the virus as nothing more than flu that wouldn't affect a strong man like him.
No meu caso particular, pelo meu histórico de atleta, caso fosse contaminado pelo vírus, não precisaria me preocupar.
And as hospitals ran out of oxygen, he refused to order lockdowns and even joked the vaccine could turn people into crocodiles.
Bolsonaro's early response to the COVID crisis was to shrug it off, to say that, COVID wasn't a big deal. And of course, that hasn't proved to be true. And COVID has killed 1 in every 500 Brazilians. The number is absolutely catastrophic.
Despite this, in the early months of the pandemic, Bolsonaro's popularity soared. This was because his government issued emergency payments to keep people out of poverty. It was one of the biggest welfare programs in Brazil's history. Without it, the number of people living on the breadline would have more than doubled. Whereas by the end of 2020, 1 million people had been lifted out of poverty. These policies led to almost godlike worship of Bolsonaro among some people. This is Barra de Pojuca, a town near Salvador in the northeast of Brazil. It's one of the poorest parts of the country, with the highest rates of unemployment. But that doesn't matter to Senor Antonio. His family runs the town fish stall, and he is a local politician and passionate Bolsonaro supporter.
Eu acho que eu acredito que Deus deu para a gente aqui, nós brasileiros, presidente para dar freio no desgoverno, em tudo. E nunca nem sonhei de ver, de sonhar de aparecer homem desses aí. Então eu acho que é uma chance que Deus deu a gente.
Senor Antonio is just one of the tens of millions of Brazilians who voted for Bolsonaro in 2018 when he was elected with 55% of the vote. But just 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable that someone like Bolsonaro would take power here. Brazil was riding high. The country was led by a progressive government headed by a woman, Dilma Rousseff. It was slated to host the upcoming World Cup and Olympics, and touted as a future economic powerhouse alongside the other BRICS economies, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The economy was booming, Over the course of 2010, GDP grew by 7.5% and poverty was falling. But then things started to change. In 2014, the country fell into a deep and lasting recession, partly caused by the end of the commodities boom and financial mismanagement by Ms. Rousseffi's Workers' Party.
The main consequence of the economic crisis was this increased perception that the political class was inefficient and didn't have the capacity to deal with those problems.
Alongside this, the Workers' Party, or PT, was engulfed in a huge corruption scandal known as Lava Jato, or car wash, after the petrol station where it was first uncovered.
It wasn't a huge surprise to people that there was corruption going on, but what was a massive shock was the scale of it. Dozens of companies were bribing the state oil firm, Petrobras, to get government contracts, and that money was then being funneled to all sorts of different political parties.
Into this came Bolsonaro, a little-known congressman who made much of his military credentials as a former army captain. He promised to bring back order to the corrupt system.
What elected him in the end wasn't so much the policies that he promised, but really this rebellion against what had been there before him.
We are going to drain the swamp!
Bolsonaro also borrowed heavily from Donald Trump's playbook. Like Trump, he used social media to rally support and position himself as a plain-speaking man of the people.
Amigos, boa noite. Jair Bolsonaro.
Even if his views were deeply offensive.
Respeito homossexual. Eles é que têm que nos respeitar.
Não fazem nada. Eu acho que nem para procriadores serve mais.
He appealed to conservative voters by promising to restore family values. And key to his election success were evangelical churches. Brazil is the world's largest Catholic country, but evangelical Protestantism is predicted to become the biggest religion here in just over 10 years' time. Back in Barra de Tijuca, worshippers at one local church are among the many evangelicals who voted for him. Cremilda is Senor Antonio's sister-in-law and has been a member of the church since she was 7.
Eu acredito que é tesouro. Minha fé é meu maior tesouro.
And she was proud to vote for Bolsonaro as a man of faith.
Que infelizmente tem alguns que se desviam, mas eu prefiro ficar com aqueles que continuam nos representando.
But now he's been in power for a few years, Cremilda is starting to question if Bolsonaro is the best man to lead Brazil, particularly given how he has handled the pandemic.
Para mim, não foi a maneira certa. Não sei diretamente dizer foi esse, porque cada um se justifica, mas vidas foram perdidas e não foram pouco. Não foram. E como a gente, quando vota em nossos representantes, queremos que eles, quando vê tal coisa, nos defendam e procurem os recursos que é para nós. E não foi assim. Quando os recursos chegou, muitas pessoas já tinham morrido e outros estavam prejudicados. E eu não acredito que se começasse mais cedo, teria resolvido sim.
Cremilda is not alone in her assessment. In recent months, Bolsonaro's popularity rating has dropped to below 30%, the lowest since he came to power. This is partly because the economic aid in the early days of the pandemic has now dried up. And the reality of Brazil's economic situation is setting in. Despite GDP recovering more strongly than expected, unemployment has hit an 18-year high. And now that the government payments have stopped, the poverty rate is higher than it has been for over a decade. But Bolsonaro shows little enthusiasm for the kind of interventions needed to get the economy back on track.
So in Bolsonaro's first year in office, they did manage to do a really important pensions reform, but then after that, the other reforms sort of stalled. He was done doing unpopular economic proposals. And so, this whole economic agenda really just stayed on the table.
But Bolsonaro's policy decisions do not just affect Brazil. Some have a bearing on the welfare of the entire planet. Brazil is home to the Amazon rainforest. And although deforestation in the Amazon had been rising since 2012, it shot up when he took office.
A lot of the damage that has been done, it's irreparable. He cut the budget of the environmental ministry. He, forced out a lot of the most competent staff. And then he also sent a really powerful message to people who are involved in deforestation, which was that it's okay with me. And the effect of that has just been catastrophic.
His record on corruption is equally dire. 2 of his sons are being investigated for corruption. This has led him to abandon anti-corruption reforms and make deals with parties tainted by the Lava Jato scandal, in the hope this will save his sons from prison and himself from impeachment.
The question is this damage that can be reparable? Is this, the kind of a situation that someone else can come in and sort of fix what he has broken? And I think that this is really the main question going forward.
Brazil's democracy is still young, and there are positive signs that it will survive Bolsonaro. The country's institutions have managed to hold him in check. Congress and the Supreme Court have blocked some of his more extreme proposals, such as allowing gun-owning Brazilians to openly carry firearms. And the pandemic has left him looking particularly vulnerable. Congress is now investigating his handling of COVID-19, which could hurt Bolsonaro in the next election. And people are on the streets calling for his impeachment.
I don't think Bolsonaro is going to be able to undermine democratic institutions in the country, because what we've been observing is that as he attacks democracy and opposes democratic institutions, he's getting progressively more isolated. He's having a really hard time governing.
Bolsonaro has tried to shore up his power through the military. But they may soon have to choose between him and democracy. The next election in 2022 promises to be a political showdown, as Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula, the most popular Brazilian president to date, has hinted he will run again. But Bolsonaro has already indicated that should he lose the election, he would not go quietly. And the events that played out on Capitol Hill earlier this year could be repeated in Brazil.
When you ask, could what happened in the US at the Capitol building happen in Brazil? I think the answer is absolutely. And what we don't know is whether it would turn out the same way, whether in the end the democratic institutions would be able to sort of take control.
So while Brazil has so far survived Bolsonaro's onslaught, the greatest challenge to its democracy may well be yet to come. And those on the ground are simply praying that things will get better.
His legacy is going to be, a tragic one. I hope that it's one that Brazil can recover from, that, Brazilian institutions can start to pick up the pieces and heal from this. I think they will, but I think it's going to be a really complicated and tense couple of years. And, it's something that the whole world should be paying attention to. Hi, I'm Sarah Maslin. I am the Brazil correspondent for The Economist. If you would like to learn more about Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, please click the link to my special report and don't forget to subscribe.